yesterday I had the immense pleasure of having a chat with Angry Foreigner. He is a very successful YouTuber. He has over 225,000 subscribers on YouTube the last time I checked. He's a Bosniak satirist and multimedia journalist. I've been watching him for a couple of years, and the reason I've been watching him for a couple of years on YouTube is because he's very good at blending humor with really high quality, intelligent content. So if you haven't checked him out on YouTube, please do so. But now here is my conversation with Angry Foreigner. We'll start with that. So tell me a little bit about your journey getting to Sweden from Bosnia.
Okay, well, I arrived in Sweden 1993. And first we were in a refugee asylum center, which was very pleasant because they had He-Man comics, and that was a very nice first meeting with Western culture. And then we relocated to a smaller place outside of Stockholm. So I feel fortunate to have grown up as a minority surrounded by Swedes, because I think that's one of the key factors to integration. I mean, you can talk about culture as a theoretical thing, as a set of norms and traditions and behavioral patterns, but it's experienced as an essence. So I felt like this was crucial to absorbing the Swedish language, picking up the Swedish way. And sadly, that's a situation I don't see for a lot of immigrants in Sweden. People really underestimate how racially segregated this country is. It really is like immigrants and Swedes grow up completely separated from each other because of the sheer volumes alone. The housing market itself creates segregation because, when you take in too many people, everyone wants to, of course, a refugee doesn't have the best job yet, and it takes time to acquire. So they tend to go for cheaper apartments where there's students, pensioners, and refugees. But when you have too many refugees, it's mostly refugees. And white flight in this country is very intense. It only takes 3 to 4% non-Europeans to move into a neighborhood before Swedes start moving out. And it's the high earners and high educated, aka the leftists, that leave first. So that's a problem in and of itself. That's also one reason why I'm critical of Sweden's migration policy, is that it naturally creates dysfunctional consequences.
So how would you say initially, as you're growing up in Sweden, would you say that very quickly you started to integrate into Sweden, or did it take a lot of time? Was it like passed into your teenage years or even adulthood where you started feeling like you were actually part of Sweden, or do you maybe still not feel like you're really part of Sweden?
Yeah, I'm still not integrated.
You're still not integrated?
No.
Wow.
People confuse this, right? Like, I find it annoying how one reason why I really hate the leftist narrative on identity politics and all that garbage is they talk as if being white gives you automatic access to inclusion, right?
Yes.
What they fail to realize is that Swedes like to exclude each other as much as they like to exclude immigrants. So it's never really a culture where you can feel comfortable and fit in. I mean, 30% of the population are eating antidepressants. Even being a white Swede passing male, I noticed how tricky the culture is here to navigate. And it's made even trickier by Swedes having this multicultural ideological complex where they constantly have to deny that Swedishness even exists. All that does is denying a social map for immigrants to navigate society. So there's a whole set of tricky norm. It takes nothing to be excluded here, really, and it doesn't have so much to do with, well, let me put it this way. All you have to do to fit in Sweden is to learn the language and speak the language clearly, dress like a metrosexual, and never express your opinion in anything ever. Just talk about the weather, talk about Melodifestivalen, talk about fika, and you're set. And that's an existence that will rob you of your soul. So I even have Americans and Australians and Polish people writing me, and even Chinese people writing me saying that, yeah, I wanted to move to Sweden, but I had to leave because there's such strong conformity in the culture that I just can't take it there. I mean, yeah, sure, their living standard might be high, but what good is a high living standard if you don't feel like you can ever truly be yourself, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it took me, so for me personally, I would say that I never really, like, I came here when I was 7 years old or so, and I can't say until I went to actually university, I would say, where I finally started kind of feeling like, yeah, Canada, I guess Canada is my country. Like I started feeling somewhat integrated. And it just makes sense in sort of the way that I thought to myself, okay, well, this is the country that allowed me to go to university. You know, I come from a small place in Bosnia, like a lot of us do. And I wasn't surely going to go to university there. So it was like, the country gave me this opportunity, and I took advantage of it. And for the first time, there was some, I guess just being thankful that, this country gave me this thing, allowed me to go to university and all that kind of stuff. And then I kind of started saying, like, why do I sort of feel more Bosnian, if you will? Why do I still connect more with Bosnia as a country, even though it's Canada that's allowing me to live, the kind of life that I want to live.
Where do
So
you live in Canada? Like, do you say the city, or do you not say the city at all?
yeah, usually I don't say the city, but
Is it a leftist place?
well, it is one of the bigger cities. So yeah, I mean, it's always a little bit more leftist when you're like in a big city. It's not a small community or anything like that. So it's
What I suspect is that Bosnians are culturally conservative, so maybe they would get on easier in a place that's like that. Whereas big cities tend to automatically be alienating in their very structure. I mean, whenever I go to Stockholm, it feels like a meat factory. It feels like, that stock footage of like sausages on a
yeah.
rolling, yeah, in a factory. That's the sensation I get from Stockholm. So.
Yeah, but yeah, these like identity things are really hard to sort of calibrate because it is kind of confusing even for myself, right? Because there is kind of a identity dilemma that goes on. But I kind of find the more when you become an adult, you start working in that country. Like one of my first jobs was for the government of Canada, and just doing a job like that, going through the university system here does give you some sense of connection to the country. But the problem is that kind of what you're saying is that it is all material. It is sort of like, this is the country that gave me this opportunity, gave me this job, gave me my university of education. So you feel a sense of obligation to it, but at the same time, yeah, what is it like? What is it really to be Canadian, so to speak, right? So you sort of still think back to, your ancestry and your ethnicity and sort of long for that. So it's a little bit, confusing, but I could say that like when I was younger in my teen years, um, I was actually dreaming of going back to Bosnia eventually because yeah, I didn't find people all that social here. You didn't know who your neighbors were, all that kind of stuff. And yeah, I felt like, wanting to go back, but it just didn't seem, and it still doesn't seem very practical, right? So
I recognize that with a lot of Bosnians,
yeah,
especially, the parents always talk about wanting to go back, but they never get around to it because, the dangerous thing is they just settle. And there's also this weird, like I often get the question, why don't you just move back to Bosnia?
yeah,
Well, this is the problem with immigration. You took me from one place to another. So now Bosnia is about as strange to me as Russia, New York, Poland, Germany. I mean,
yeah.
I might as well move to Japan if I'm going to move home to Bosnia because you don't have the social connections, you don't have the close friends, you don't have the life you've built, you don't have the memories. It's why an immigration policy should be very well reasoned and clear and communicative, because ultimately you might just be playing Russian roulette with people's lives and sense of identity. So I'm not against immigration as a concept, but I am against the specific way that Sweden has been doing it. And I do have to say that Canada seems like a paradise compared to Sweden, because I can't really understate how classist this society is. Like literally, if you're a metalhead, they will treat you like an N-word.
Wow.
Yeah, well, that's all it takes. I mean, I have goth friends who are getting yelled at by Swedish men who are adults because of their clothing style. So, I mean, that's not something, at least in America and Canada, you can be yourself in that regard. Like, yeah, sure, maybe you have the alienation that usually comes with a big city, but or at least you can be yourself to a certain degree. Here, it's like, there's a reason why I call it the incest village of the world.
In some sense, Swedish people want you to conform in a sense of being just this plain John, or whatever you will.
Yeah, like Swedish people want you to be exactly like them. Right. If they don't, they consider it a personal insult. It's kind of like constantly being surrounded by female stereotypes.
Yeah.
I don't feel like there's any men in Sweden, for that matter. Forget politics, left, right, feminist, anti-feminist. They're all still Swedish, right?
Yeah.
So you have this weird thing where, well, let's take, for example, I get this a lot with expats, right? They tell me how they were ostracized from their place at work because they didn't want to partake in fika, meaning lunch breaks, where you eat a bun and talk shit to people. If you don't participate in that social ritual in your workplace, they take offense to it and make you ostracized. Like, that happens a lot. Just silly little things like that. And it really goes for anything. I mean, the unofficial national dress code for this country is business casual. So if you don't dress like a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, like that's Tim Cook guy or whatever he's called.
Yeah.
Then they stare at you like you're a retard. That's another thing that's weird with this country. Like, in any country in the world, having people stare at you and not say anything means they either want to fight you or fuck you. Any country, that's how it works.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. And
but here they expect you to kind of just take it. So I've actually had Americans tell me about this, where this one guy was talking about how he was in a store, right? And he saw this elderly lady just staring at him. So he said, like, hi. And she says nothing, looks scared, and runs away.
Yeah.
That's Swedishness in an essence.
Wow.
These are people who are afraid to say hi to their neighbors.
So is it these same people that are pulling for the mass immigration? These same people who want conformity are pulling for mass immigration to, in essence, have something to hate, I guess?
No. It's more that I've never come across a people with such complete and utter lack of self-distance. They don't know themselves. They say that they want diversity because it sounds nice, but once they have it, they flip-flop. So NIMBY, not in my backyard, that's a phrase, look it up. I would say NIMBY culture is Swedish culture. I mean, you have a majority of the people voting for mass immigration, voting for Islamization, voting for all of this super progressive stuff, but they don't have it in their personal lives. And when they're asked to have it, they flip-flop and become Sweden Democrats.
Yeah. So part of it then is definitely a lack of self-awareness on the part of these people.
Yeah, and you see the same thing in Canada. I mean, I remember Rebel Media did the same thing where they went around and asked people, like, are you pro-immigration? Yes. Would you take a refugee in your house? No, absolutely not. Let the government solve that.
Yeah. I mean, that's a huge problem that we cover a lot on the podcast. It's people who want to do a specific thing, are for a specific thing, but don't face the consequence of having that thing come true. I mean, you see a lot of it happen as well in the U.S. with, letting, people come through the border at the Mexico-U.S. border. And a lot of these wealthy people, they're living, behind, fences. And again, they never have to interact with any of these, poor people that will be coming into, into their cities. They'll be fenced off. And since they don't have to deal with these people, they like, it's nothing to them. They're like,
Yeah,
they
and
just stay
it's
away.
also another example of this is the whole business exodus with California that Elon
Yeah,
Musk and Ben Shapiro were talking about, how leftists vote for leftist policies ruin wherever they live, so they
yeah,
move to more conservative states
yeah, yeah.
and sadly repeat the same mistakes there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we've seen that happen with obviously, Joe Rogan, well-known podcaster. He moved essentially very, I would say, liberal guy, um, but especially on social policies. But then, he gets upset with the homeless stuff and the all the traffic and all that. And again, he for most part is sort of, that stuff is hidden from him because he doesn't live downtown Los Angeles where you can clearly see the homeless crisis getting out of control. He's fenced off, but nevertheless, it still bothers him to the point that he decides to move to Texas, where maybe that's not going to be as a big issue. So yeah, I mean,
It's
yeah,
also we should kind of clarify, this isn't just about immigration. Like another study that was done showed that the majority of Swedes want alternative energy, blah blah blah. They want windmills, wind. What do you
yeah,
call that? Yeah,
windmills,
uh,
or yeah,
yeah. They want windmills for energy, but when they're asked if they want it next to them, they say no.
yeah,
Only like 60% wanted it, but 30% were willing to put up with it. So this is a huge problem of democracy, is that people are treating democracy like a fashion statement, which in the long term undermines democracy as a process.
yeah, yeah,
We're
yeah,
going to see polarization because of this, just because people don't spend the time to really think about themselves and practice self-distance. I think that's a big danger. So when I'm against immigration and I'm against all this stuff, it's not for some identitarian reason. It's for the simple fact that it's not very functional when you're doing it with structural hypocrisy built in.
yeah. Well, part of the problem is that like we're so now divorced, having moved into like big cities and urbanization and everything, is like we're so disconnected from actually nature and like the processes of how things get like how we get certain things, like how do we actually get electricity to people's house, or how do we get food into the stores and all that, like people don't have like a basic understanding of like how all of that stuff occurs, but they want to change it. Like like the same people that
Mm-hmm.
talk about climate change and we're ruining the environment are the same people that would like die if electricity was turned off for like a day or two. So
They're
it's
the
like,
same people that are doing the most airplane travel.
yeah, exactly. So there's like, yeah, there's this disconnect to how things actually work in reality. So then, yeah, people are able to, as you say, make these sort of like fashion statements or whatnot, um, without really, yeah, feeling any consequences. At least, in the short term, they certainly will, find it in the long term. Now, since I am a conservative, like for example, um, just to kind of change it to a little bit back to immigration, like a lot of people in the West, at least people on the conservative right wing people, have said, we don't want Muslim immigration, let's say, because, like they would bring up terrorism. And I always thought to myself, okay, well, could it increase terrorism a little bit? Sure. But that's not really the main problem. The main problem is that if you do mass immigration, you're going to change the values of that country. So it's the values that are the problem, because if you focus on the terrorism, you're missing the overall point, that if you change very quickly the composition of the country, where you're where eventually these people are going to be like, leftists on one hand have issues with regular Christian conservatives, but they are okay for allowing mass immigration of people that have, I mean, it doesn't even matter what religion you have, but that have way more extreme beliefs than your typical Christian American conservative. So I don't get this, how they're okay allowing people into the country that are actually more extreme versions of American Christians, let's say.
Yeah, for
So,
example, I saw that half of Muslims in London want to outright ban homosexuality.
right. So it's like, how does a leftist, like, how do they make sense of that? That they are allowing people in that are more conservative, if you will, than your typical Canadian or American Christian. So I don't like, I don't know. I mean, do these people not have any survival instinct, or like, I'm not really sure what the problem is. It, I guess, goes back to maybe again the self awareness thing. Um,
Well, if they're playing the game of identity politics, then reality doesn't really matter. I mean, they're just, this is the racism of low expectations. They look at immigrants as pets. They look at them as bricks
yeah,
on some kind of ideological chessboard, and they don't actually care about them because they don't hang out with them. As soon as
yeah,
they do, they're like, oh my God, you bigot. So
yeah, yeah,
and there's an annoying disconnect here, especially I've noticed this a lot with Bosnians,
yeah,
is that Bosnians are Muslims, sure, but they're European secular Muslims. And it's really, I wouldn't even describe Bosnia as a Muslim country because there's equally as many mosques as there's synagogues and cathedrals and, churches. It's a secular country. It's not a country where Islam has an influence on public law and public norms in that sense. And something you notice in Sweden, which is very annoying, is that when I talk about Islamization, I refer to things such as Sharia police in the ghetto and Muslim rape gangs that you see coming up all across England, Britain. I mean, and the sad thing is, the main people that are protesting this are imams that are trying to warn the public that Saudi Arabia is funding mosque buildings all across Europe, also in Bosnia, and they are doing it with, it's not free. They expect you to accept their Wahhabist preachers who then radicalize the local Muslim populations. And so I've seen numerous imams say that these rape gangs are being instructed by Salafist imams that have managed to convince them that certain Western women need to be punished for being too Western. That's the kind of thing I talk about with Islamization. It's not the presence of Muslims, it's when Islamists gain control over the public, which is something you see a lot in Sweden. It's a very worrying development. You've seen honor culture and honor violence increase in the past years. It should have been decreasing. It shouldn't have been increasing. And so whenever you want to criticize Salafism, Wahhabism, Islamization, the Saudi activities, Bosnians get butthurt and offended because they're like, oh, I'm a Muslim too. No one's fucking talking about you. I mean, Bosnians are shit at being Muslims. They bang before marriage. They get tattoos. They drink alcohol. They believe more in cigarettes and soccer than they believe in God. I mean, the problem is, I just want to make my point here. The problem is that no one cares about secular Muslims. And when you look at the general values surrounding the view of Jewish people, the view of homosexuals, the view of atheists in most Muslim countries on the planet, no one cares about Bosnia. I mean, when you talk about the problem of Islam and Islamization, you're focusing on 95% of Muslim countries. You're not focusing on the one exception to the rule that is Bosnia, where it's not even noticeable that you're a Muslim. Well, then nobody cares.
Exactly.
And they just conflate this because a Muslim to us is a cultural identity. Like I like to celebrate Ramadan with my family. I think all that stuff is cute, but to us, religion is more cosmetic than it is a lifestyle, really. Whereas you can't say the same about certain other people where their culture has been too influenced by more radical versions of Islam. And sure, it's all tied together with American foreign policy and in the way that Obama and Clinton has been, empowering ISIS down there and yada, yada, yada. But at the end, you still have this problem where 50% of Muslims in London want to ban homosexuality, and they're not Bosnians.
Yeah. Yeah, I figured, even though, I mean, in Bosnia, what you have is when it comes to things like homosexuality, you have a situation where it's more just people are traditional, but not necessarily religious, right? So, you know, they
Yes, it's more
believe
cultural conservatism to us.
exactly. It's not, you know, from the actual religious basis. So it's a little bit different, yeah, in that sense. Um, yeah, I mean,
Well, I feel another danger here is that the progressive mindset of being colorblind reminds me of the Chetnik mindset. I
mhm,
mean, they didn't differentiate between Muslims either. I'm at least trying to explain that there are different kinds of Muslims. Some are better than others because some are more adaptable to Western culture than others.
yeah,
And when I'm trying to explain that you shouldn't bundle people up, you should differentiate, you should see the differences so you can actually get a better understanding of things. I have Bosnians in Sweden that are too Swedified. They essentially can't be separated from a Swedish social democrat. So they pull the same social justice cliches and yap about how, all Muslims are the same, all Muslims are great. And I'm like, well, you're not really separating yourself from the more radical ones when you're doing that. You're committing the
yeah.
same thought error as the Chetniks did. And you're not really helping fight radicalization by conflating yourself with a Salafist.
Right. Yeah, I did actually want to ask you about that. Like, how, if at all, has the Bosnian conflict informed how you see immigration or mass immigration situation in Sweden? Like, is there anything that's informed you about that situation? Because for me, looking back at it, obviously not when I was a teenager, but looking back at it last few years, I have to say, because I used to be, I would say I was more of a sort of left, I wouldn't say progressive, but maybe like social liberal type. Um, and I, over time, I've gone more conservative. And in part, it's been by reinterpreting and rethinking the Bosnian conflict and how I don't want that same thing to end up happening here. And,
Yeah, I
part
feel
of,
the same way.
yeah. So that's why I wanted to ask you, because, when you look at the, Bosnian conflict, you have that same situation, like here, people like to keep talking about, racism and things like that, even though, of course, if you look at the whole history, not just the last 100 years, it's been tribe against tribe, same race against same race, because you're a different ethnicity or you're a different tribe. It hasn't been this one race versus another race thing. That's actually a fairly modern, fairly new thing if you look at whole modern human history, right? It's a very small part of it. So it's almost like people in the West don't realize that there is a whole bunch of ways that people differentiate themselves, fragment themselves. It's not simply based on, oh, you're a different race. Like, that's a fairly actually new thing. And it happened in Bosnia. Three, everybody's white, but it happened there. In Nigeria
Yeah,
right
yeah,
now.
yeah. That's something that people don't understand is throughout history, white people have fought other white people
Yeah.
more than
In
anything.
in Nigeria right now, there's 250 ethnicities or tribes in Nigeria. Their last year or so, they've been fighting each other. A lot of gruesome violence and killing. So this has nothing to do with race. That's just one component of it. But the question, Western people have to ask themselves is, you know, do your values matter or not? Because if you don't believe anymore that people should be judged based on just their individual merits, and you start thinking that we should be grouping people and saying Muslims are this, and getting into this whole group rights instead of looking at individual rights, well, then you're going to go down a very similar path that we went in Yugoslavia. And I think people don't also understand that there's a constant identity fight that occurs in people's personal life, but also a group way. So, for example, one of the problems in the Bosnian conflict is that you essentially had, Serbs or Chetniks saying that essentially all Bosniaks or Bosnian Muslims are bastardized Serbs. That was essentially
Turkish rape babies.
Yeah, exactly. So that's all they are. And if these people could just admit that they're actually us, then we won't have any problem. Why wouldn't we live together when you guys are just bastardized Serbs? The problem is you're not going to get people to agree with you when that's what you think about them, and also the fact that that's not the actual truth. So you're constantly having these identity battles between groups, and I think that is essentially like the main thing that led to the conflict. Of course, the main thing being that we had with Tito being in power for so long, we basically didn't allow people to speak, didn't allow people to express themselves. Yet the people on the ground still had those beliefs. It's not like if you ban speech, people stop feeling a certain way. It just goes into the underground. People continue talking about it on the local level. People in their little communities talk about, those, dirty Serbs or those dirty Muslims. They continue talking about these things. They continue feeling them, but it goes into the underground. You don't hear about it in the media like you would hear about it here in the West. And then eventually people explode, right?
Yeah, well, this is something creepy that I think it's amazing no one ever thought about, is the fact that multiculturalism with a bunch of white people could only work through a dictatorship. That's something people don't seem to realize, because what happens is with every ethnicity, you have a majority that are peaceful and just want to have normal lives and just want to, work and live and do well by themselves. Well, that's why they're completely useless when extremists come with guns and AK-47s.
Yeah.
That's why they make themselves useless to war. And throughout history, all we've seen is that minorities drive all change, whether it's for good or bad, whether it's the Nazis in Germany, whether it's the Chetniks, whether it's the civil rights movements in America with Martin Luther King. That was also a minority that pushed for good change. But the opposite is also true, that minorities can push for bad change. The point being that minorities are always responsible for change. So what happens with multiculturalism is you mix ethnic groups where most of the largest percentage of the ethnic group is going to be fine, but war is not carried out by majorities. Conflict is carried out by the radical minorities. And that's the problem with mixing a bunch of radical minorities together, is that ultimately you create kind of a powder keg.
Exactly. That's very well said in one sentence, what you just said there, that even white, like in a majority white country, all white country, you needed a dictator to hold things together. Now we could go and talk about how I think just the whole socialist communist system in Yugoslavia, like in large part, obviously was as well the problem. I get, there's like so many different versions of socialism that it's hard to just say socialism, because there's so many,
it has like 29 different definitions, right?
Exactly. There's different, like there's even a decentralized form of socialism. So, it's hard to talk about, but it's like, I do feel that if Yugoslavia had been set up maybe differently, maybe.
Well, yeah, I mean, here's my thought on that.
Yeah.
Right. When I think about what happened and who did what in Bosnia, it was all of them were socialist nationalist groups. There was no right-wing group. The Chetniks were socialists.
Yeah.
Milosevic was a socialist. There wasn't any right-wing there. There wasn't any, and it wasn't even about religion, really. I mean, Yugoslavia collapsed because Tito made really poor investments, too much debt amassed. There was going to be a financial crisis sooner or later. That's usually what triggers wars. Yeah. And Milosevic used religion to prolong the dream of a greater Serbia. I mean, he wanted to get the natural resources of Croatia. He wanted to get the natural resources of Bosnia. Like, there's many geographical implications to why you would want to expand, right? Yeah. So it felt to me like it wasn't really about religion, because Croats and Serbs are Catholics and Orthodox. They're both Christians, and they hate each other. They hate each other more than the Muslims, It's like, why do they hate the Christians as much as the Muslims?
Yeah.
Because it wasn't really about religion after all. I mean, there's so many complex. And then if you look at how people acted during World War II, there was all these fractions, and it all adds up to a big shit show. And I just feel like what you had was just various layers of collectivism piled on collectivism.
Yeah.
So I believe that you could potentially make a multiculturalism work if you had an individualistic focus and a zero tolerance towards identity politics, collectivism, and basically what goes against the core of the nation.
Yeah, exactly. I 100% agree. And I think, if you made free speech a priority, like they do in the US, because this stuff does need to be hashed out. Because, when I was younger, when I was in my teen years, I bought into the idea that if you look at the war, what really caused it was, eventually when Tito died, it was a free-for-all in terms of, leaders coming on and being able to say everything that they wanted to say, right? And certainly that increased sort of how emotional people got and all that. But you can't just look at the end, right? We have to look at the whole story. And the whole story is that people were prevented from expressing themselves this whole time. So that was the natural result of that. And the problem is, for those 50 years, that Yugoslavia was around, or I think it was around there, maybe 40, 50, people hadn't learned to communicate in that way. It's a skill, right? You can't all of the sudden, you're prevented from expressing yourself. And then all of the sudden, when Tito dies, be expected to know how to use that skill. And that hearing the stuff on, TV that you heard from people like Karadzic and all that, that in some sense, people were not used to hearing that kind of vitriol on, on TV. They hadn't heard of that. And all of a sudden they hear this. Of course, people are going to go crazy. So it's like, it has to become part of the actual society that you talk about these things and, realize that if you don't talk and if you can't solve your problems through actual speech, it's going to go to the only other alternative, which is going to be to physically fight. I mean, you even see this, in mental health, right? You see a huge proportion of people who have some kind of communication problem. Sometimes it's just a lack of intelligence, right? Or they just haven't built up that skill. And you see a lot of people that can't communicate in jail, because what happens is, if you can't communicate or you don't build that skill, the thing that you go after is you get frustrated and you start hitting instead. So
yeah, this is a very clear pattern with criminals and violence, is that people who lack verbal intelligence and emotional intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you have a similar dynamic going if you don't actually use that skill and you actually say, not only are we not going to develop this skill of, communication, but we're actually going to say it's very, very bad, because it causes people to get all heated up, and that just causes people to fight. So
it's the classic psychology of repression, right? I mean, whenever you go to a psychologist, you're not advised to suppress your feelings and to not talk about stuff, because doing so either leads to you getting anal cancer, or it leads to you becoming very violent. It's like the movie Joker, right? I found that was a very good depiction of the nice guy villain, right? Because throughout the whole movie, he's being such a nice guy that he just builds up this. It's like the Adam Sandler movie Anger Management. Like it's so funny how Jack Nicholson's character is like, no, you have dangerous anger. You have the implosive anger where you never let it out, not even a little bit at a time, and eventually you explode. And through the movie, you see how that actually turned out to be true. And it's the same case for the Joker movie, is that he's a nice guy the whole time. He doesn't even let it out in healthy phases, healthy doses, and you end up having a homicidal maniac. I mean, that's the classic psychology of repression.
Right. And you certainly wouldn't have a psychologist tell you, well, if you're dealing, you're dealing with anxiety, social anxiety or something like that, you certainly wouldn't, get advice like, well, don't worry about it. You really need to, start blaming other people for this problem. And, that's really gonna, let's blame, your parents, let's blame all these people because, this is really gonna help you get over it. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
not gonna happen. There, the only way that you're gonna deal with the social anxiety is to voluntarily start slowly building up, the things that you're afraid of, start actually voluntarily doing them slowly
And be uncomfortable, really.
and be uncomfortable and maybe do something that you're so passionate about that it's so good that it's worth the anxiety kind of thing.
Hmm.
I think that's how you get over it. But yeah, so
Well,
it's
I just want to say that this does tie into it because I mean, a nation is made up of individuals, so the psychology that applies to individuals does apply to nations as well. And this is the very dangerous thing with political correctness. In fact, there was a study done by Norwegian scientists on Sweden. They wanted to find out why has Sweden had the most Nazi murders per capita in Europe the past 25 years. That's a very, remarkable statistic for a progressive
wow,
utopia to
yeah, it
have
is.
the most Nazi murders per capita. And what they looked at was the combination of the biggest immigration in the entire West combined with the Overton window, the censorship aura, the fact that
Mm,
these questions are not being discussed in the public, they're being suppressed, and people don't feel understood. And the only social alternative they end up having is the radicals that are happy to receive them.
right.
So you can say this playing out in real time here. And I wouldn't be surprised if things flip so hard in the future that in 20 years, ethno nationalism is going to be the norm here, just because people are so clueless and censored and unwilling to talk about what's perceived as unhealthy emotions. Well, if it's unhealthy emotions, it's even more important to hash it out and explore it.
Exactly. So before we move on from this topic, I was going to ask, so where do you see yourself politically? Like, do you see yourself like this? Is there any sort of political ideology that describes your current beliefs, or are you sort of all over the place depending on the issue?
All over the place.
All over the
Well,
place.
it's some form of centrism. Like when I do these political compass
Yeah.
tests, I end up being left of center,
Hmm.
but in social issues, I end up being a conservative.
Oh wow. Okay. Um, I did actually want to talk about one thing because, yeah, I watched one of your videos where you were talking about the welfare state, and it did seem you said, I believe, the welfare state was something to be proud of, a positive idea, but then it got strained, right, with all the mass immigration, and then it sort of made the welfare state look like a bad thing, right? Not
Hmm.
because it in itself is a bad thing, but because it got strained and naturally, the people, who were maybe not taking advantage of that system, got resentful, right? They're like, well, why are these people? All of these people en masse are getting all these benefits for free, and they don't seem to actually be integrating into the society or any of that. Like, why should they? So you started getting resentment from other people, not
Hmm.
necessarily because the idea of a welfare state is bad, but because of the strain. So so would you say that in general you would be for, like, you don't have anything against a welfare state? It's just the way Sweden has handled it, essentially.
Well, you can. This is something the most serious economists agree on is that you can't have mass immigration and a welfare state. You can't have
Yeah.
open borders and a welfare state. I mean, even Bernie Sanders talked about this. How open borders is a Koch brothers proposal because what happens with mass immigration is the unions are subdued. You have wage suppression, wage dumping. It benefits corporations more than it benefits the working class. It's the volume that is the problem. You're flooding so many people that the time they have to adapt doesn't catch up. So in the end, it never catches up. That's the big problem of it. In my take, I think it is very important to have social safety nets. Uh, it's very important, but the government should be used as a necessary evil, kind of like how police and military violence is used as a necessary evil to protect against larger evil. I mean, without a military, ISIS could just march in and take over a country, right? So it's important for the same reason that law and order is important. The government should be as small as possible, but it should fulfill the core responsibilities of. It should be there for the people. It
Yeah,
should be taking care of the people in form of social safety nets and police and
yeah,
military and public schooling and then good quality mental care, things like that. But the rest needs to be up to the people to teach them the personal responsibility required to maintain a democracy in the long run. And what
yeah,
happens with there's a difference between a welfare opportunity, a welfare availability, and a welfare state in the form of big government. Because something I've noticed in Sweden is that they make you dependent on welfare rather than having it as a social safety net. They make you dependent on it in the sense that tons of fake jobs are created just to keep people state loyal. I mean, I used to be on welfare a long time ago. Thank God I got off welfare thanks to YouTube, because I do this as a job now. I pay taxes and all of that stuff. But I used to be on welfare, and something I noticed was they don't help you. They don't give you the
yeah,
mental tools needed to develop an understanding for your potential, to explore yourself, to figure out what you could possibly do that's helpful. It's just endless meeting after meeting after meeting with this sleepy government employee that's happy to have a job there because they feel important, they feel like
yeah,
they're helping you, and that makes them more likely to keep voting for big government because it means having a job for them.
yeah. And I mean,
But
here, anyways, they have a lot of disincentives because, essentially, if you earn a certain amount of money, they take it away from you, or you lose, like, very quickly, you lose, your rights to social assistance if you start earning money. It's like, why would you want to do that? And, you know, keep the person on the program for a while longer, but, like, don't make it seem like getting the job is somehow they lose by getting a job.
mhm.
By taking away some of their money. It's like, let them do that job for months on end, and if they stay there for 6 months, then okay, gradually maybe take some of that money away until it's totally gone. But they set up the system where essentially 50-50, where if you start a job and you earn $1,000, we're going to take 1,000 from you, or something like this. And it's just, it's not a very good incentive system to get people to actually get back to work.
No, because what happens then is they would rather stay on welfare, get
Exactly.
more money, more security, and not even
And then you have
dare
it
venture into
exactly. Then you
labor.
have, sort of, in the, like, correlated programs where, like, okay, well, if you have a kid below a certain age, we'll give you extra money. And then you have people having extra kids just to get the extra money,
Hmm.
in large part. So yeah, it's this. I mean, I agree with you. So I'm more conservative, but I am not necessarily against a welfare state, or having that social safety net. You know, bad things, bad luck, can happen to anybody, and
Well, it's a way to.
you
I mean,
know,
I used to think, and this is a conflation that socialists like you to believe, is that socialism equals welfare checks.
yeah,
That's not true. That's not the same as big government. I mean, having a social safety net is not the same as big government. Meaning, in
yeah,
Sweden, we're seeing more taxes go to things like leftist art, leftist lectures in school, various funding to the media, various severance fees to politicians. There's a lot more money going to ideological projects than it is going to our weakest. We're seeing the welfare
yeah.
state in Sweden be hollowed out. I think it was 9 out of 10 people seeking assistance nowadays are getting denied because we're running out of money in Sweden.
Right.
So
I mean, there's a lot
that's
of
just scary. But people need to understand that a social safety net system done right is actually a stimulation for the economy because it helps people develop long term.
yeah, it can be. I mean, there's so many, like, misunderstandings or misinterpretations about, um, about these things. I mean, I think a lot of the time from socialists, like I think people even confuse big government with limited government, you know, because
Mm-hmm.
I think the limit is more important than the size of the government. So, and what I mean by the limit, there has to be something, whether it's constitutional or just within the culture, that values things that are uh, a way of preventing the government from having too much, uh, from actually taking away the current rights that that population has. So if you have a culture like the US where, you know, it's in the Constitution, free speech, the right to bear arms. So like right to bear arms is a great one. And actually both of those are, like, I would say, the two main ones. When you have those kinds of rights, you are making the government, you know, have second thoughts if they ever want to try to, you know, do something that would go against people's individual rights, right? So that I would say is more important than necessarily the size of the government. But then the second level is when you live in a more heterogeneous country like the United States, you also want that, though, power to be ideally decentralized, because you do
Mm-hmm.
have so many different groups region by region. That's basically how I look at it. Many of my problems that from, let's say, the Bernie side and the socialists is that they refuse to acknowledge the way that the United States was founded, in that there was this fight between federalists and anti-federalists. That initially the United States was it was basically not even a country, because the northern and southern states were essentially allies in terms of the military, but not much else. And then the Federalists essentially made America a little bit more centralized. But again, the Anti-Federalists were part of that discussion, and they fought against America becoming too decentralized or centralized, in part because, yeah, it is a very, you know, heterogeneous country, and it's even becoming more so. So my issue with socialists, with the Bernie Sanders and all those people, is that they often, you know, when they talk about universal healthcare, for example, they want to do it at the national level.
Mm-hmm.
There's no need to do that, especially in a big country like the United States. California, for example, it's more of a country than most countries. It is, when you look at its state domestic product, I believe it's like fifth in the world. So they're ahead of many countries when it comes to their state domestic product.
Well, yeah,
Obviously,
people
it's a
don't
large state.
usually. Yeah, what
It's,
people don't usually think about this is that Sweden is the size of a state in America. I mean,
yeah,
America is made up of 51
yeah.
countries, basically. So,
Well, yeah, you have to balance the, you know, the different regions are going to have a different culture, are going to want to handle things, you know, a different way. So while I'm all for a state that, you know, gives people benefits, I think that kind of stuff has to be done at a more local level, and it can be done at a more local level because, as I just mentioned, you know, a lot of these states, their economies are so large that they're bigger than most actual countries. So there's no reason why it can't start with California, Texas, New York State. Let's say the healthcare.
mhm.
Make it universal in California, make it, you know, universal in New York, and if it works, and then other groups want to do that same thing, they see the benefits, it works well, there's no reason that they can't just do that by themselves and say, well, maybe actually now, you know, you might have conservative states actually saying now, well, actually now we are for universal healthcare. We're okay with it being across the whole country, or maybe they do a system of their own. But I think you can't do this kind of thing in such a big and heterogeneous country as America as you can do in Sweden, which is still, at least for now, a fairly homogeneous and small country geography wise.
Well, yeah, I mean, that would ruin the diversity of America. That would
Yeah.
ruin the freedom of choice and what makes America such a beautiful country. And I mean, I've noticed that there's a bigger cultural difference between Texas and New York than there is between certain European countries.
Oh
So
yeah.
you really can't just want to do shit on the federal level. I actually like the decentralization of America and states, and Canada with its provinces. There's a big difference between Victoria and Alberta, for example.
Mm-hmm.
All those things create freedom of choice because it means you can move somewhere if you want to live in a different kind of place. What scares me about the globalization trend and the multiculturalism hype and the progressivism is it really does seek to make every single country on earth the exact same.
Yeah.
So in the end, everyone's living in a fucking Blade Runner society that's dystopian as shit. It's a melting pot of identitylessness, and there's no real freedom of choice. It's not an issue of demographics as much as it's an issue of diversity, really, political diversity.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree on that. Maybe we'll end off talking about, since we're still on this topic, so a lot of people do make the claim that Sweden is socialist. Bernie Sanders, of course, has made that connection. Mm-hmm. So how would you explain the system in Sweden?
Well, socialism is always tricky and deceptive. So it's absolutely a socialist culture in the sense of culture, but it's not socialist necessarily in its financial framework, but it's also the same thing as China. You don't deny that China is a authoritarian communist shithole, but they've started using capitalism to enforce their communism. And you see the same thing in Sweden, is that they use capitalism to. So, for example, in Sweden, you do have, you can start a company. There's a free market. There's no minimum wage in Sweden, which is sick. There's no regulated minimum wage, so you automatically have wage dumping happening with mass immigration. It absolutely hurts the working class. But they also have super high taxes, and the high taxes are being used to fund ideological projects. So when I say that, I mean, for example, a feminist YouTuber can go to a municipality and earn 50,000 in Swedish crowns just by holding a lecture, and it's tax-funded money. Oh. And, take, for example, there was this artist that wanted to break the law in France. France banned the burqa. She got 100,000 in tax funding, to do a stupid fucking art movie where she goes to France, wears a burqa, gets arrested, gets kicked out. That's my tax money is funding that shit.
Wow.
Yeah. That's just, these are just a few examples. I'm just talking about the cultural sector here. Yeah. There's also the sick, for example, a politician that got Me Too'd was forced to leave politics. He was rewarded with 1 million in a severance fee. We call that a parachute here. So the taxes in Sweden are going towards funding political parties, funding politician luxury, funding all kinds of ideological nonsense, while it's not really going to the people. And this is a typical classic thing with socialism, is they lure you in by saying, oh, it's about welfare checks, it's about social security, it's about blah, blah, blah. And then the taxes are spent on enforcing the ideology. Because you really have to, living here has taught me the value of differentiating words and promises from actions, differentiating the theory from the practice. Socialism has the most beautiful promises and slogans of all political movements, but it rarely fails to deliver those in practice. And now I remember what my point was. My point was that the government is a bunch of suits. It's amazing to me how socialists want to pose as revolutionaries and rebels and critics of the system, and they're so goddamn dorky. They expect a bunch of bureaucrats to save them, to save the people. Obviously, that's never going to happen because bureaucrats are bureaucrats. If you've seen the movie Brazil by that Monty Python guy, you understand what bureaucrats are like. They're not people as much as they're robots. And why would you expect a bunch of suits to care about people? They don't.
Well,
so
there's no incentive for them to care. Imagine if there was a company, that got money every year, no matter what they did. That's the government. It doesn't matter what they do. We saw it during this COVID mess. Lockdowns and all of that. Well, it's very easy to lock down a country when, whether you lock it down or not, you still get paid normally. Well, other people are not in that same situation. They actually have to go to work. You
Hmm.
get to just take their tax money every year, no questions asked. It doesn't matter how well the country is doing. The country could be going to hell. The government workers still get paid. So it's kind of that thing we mentioned earlier on, just that there's certain people that take certain actions because there's actually no consequences for it going either way. So it's like, well, why not? My job is gonna be safe. I need to do what's gonna keep my job safe. And yeah, I mean, it honestly isn't more. I don't think it's really all that more complicated than that.
No, it's as simple as the fact that they don't live in our reality. They
Yeah,
get a nice big salary, so they don't have to live amongst us. They don't have to care, and it doesn't really matter to them what happens or not because the paycheck is still coming in. And the dangerous thing about enacting these law changes, these big government policies, is they're harder to get rid of than they are to put in place.
yeah, yeah. Well, exactly. Um,
I feel also that, I mean, the fact of the matter is that capitalism beat communism and gave us some of the best Western nations in the world that are inherently connected with democracy, freedom,
yeah,
equality, all those nice, beautiful, progressive values that are actually progressive, not regressive.
yeah,
And now we have, I mean, I feel like capitalism succeeded in everything, but it left us with the spiritual crisis. The
mhm,
spiritual crisis in the sense that we are responsible for our own happiness. We are, just because we have the opportunity to consume doesn't mean we should consume blindly. So I
yeah,
feel like something that's never being phrased is the fact that if you feel alienation, if you feel, you know, of course, there's going to be something created in the form of a consumer society, but you're supposed to solve that through your own means by choosing not to consume. But people don't aren't really used to freedom. I mean, freedom and democracy relatively are very modern phenomena that are short-lived experiments that haven't existed for long throughout history. So people aren't really used to the responsibility of solving your own problems with freedom. Freedom actually gives people more anxiety, and that's not something we usually talk about.
no, no, and I'm glad you went there. I mean, we talk a lot about that actually, the spiritual crisis in the Western world, because that is definitely the main issue there. It's certainly not, what some of the leftists would make it seem that there's an issue. The main issue is like poverty and people being discriminated against. Those certainly aren't the main issues. It is really that, I think, that spiritual crisis, people losing every sense of like meaningful identity, and identity that has actually survived over time, right? I mean, you can make any criticism, and I make it myself, about Christianity or different religious systems, but the difference between those systems and these new identities that are popping up are that it has evolutionarily survived. It's been
Hmm.
tested and survived. So that means it has utility, you know? And
Yes.
it seems that people are trying to replace those traditional things with, you know, uh, basing their identity on their sexuality, or basing their identity on, that they're trans. And I have nothing against any of these people, or whatever, decisions they decide to make. But the problem is that you're going to live a fairly empty life if you base your identity on these non-proven, non-tested, I should say, uh, identities like this.
Well, it's basically telling people to over-identify with their biological factors, which is not
Exactly.
their soul-connected factors. It's not their
Yeah.
personality. It's not their individuality. It's a form of convoluted modern collectivism, really.
Yeah.
And and the way you describe it is interesting because this is what Nietzsche predicted, right? Uh, the philosopher Nietzsche predicted that when he said that God is dead, it wasn't really meant as a celebration. It was meant as a statement of fact. We killed God, so what's going to happen now? Well, Jordan Peterson talked about this, and I've seen other people
Hmm.
talk about this, is how Nietzsche essentially predicted communism and National Socialism.
Right.
What happened was that when we killed God, we started treating politics like religion. And
Yeah.
today you see this very clearly, this tribalism where people are just drawn to politics as a community rather than really thinking through the ideas. It makes them act like brainwashed hive minds rather than people seeking a constructive meaning, right? So you
Yeah.
have people over identifying with this shit and they're excluding people based on politics. They don't want to deal with, they want to exclude family members and shut down Facebook pages because they don't agree with political stuff. And it's just tearing people apart. It's an ideological toxin. So being anti-ideology, I mean, people should understand that ideology is toxic in and of itself, which is
Yeah.
why I kind of refuse to relate fully with any ideology. I can critique both left and right on many topics,
Yeah.
because when they treat it like religion, they start getting irrational and they start
Yeah.
alienating themselves from another.
We can say a lot of great things about religion, but if a religion does not adapt to its environment, it serves to no longer be useful. And
Mm-hmm.
that's a big problem with Islam. But you could say that maybe it is somewhat adapted to the environment if you're actually living in the Arab countries themselves, but not really if you come to a Western country, because things are so much, so different here. Um, but yeah, one thing that Jordan Peterson talks about, and I thought it was a great point, is that the reason that people actually fight and get violent with other people is that these identities, our religion, our the traditions, and all of that, they actually regulate our emotions. Again, going back to the Bosnian conflict, it explains a lot, like a lot of how that started up, in that people felt so, like, even though Bosnian people are not religious, that was your tribe. That's still your tribe. Like, you're still going to be fighting on the side of other Bosniaks. That's who you
Well,
connect
this
with.
makes me think of a pretty. There's a testimony that always stuck with me about a Bosnian soldier.
Hmm.
Um, he was saying basically that he wasn't religious before the war,
Hmm.
but the Chetniks went on. I mean, basically, the ethno-nationalists went on and on about how you're Muslims, you're Islamists, you're this and you're
Yeah.
that. He never identified with any of that before, but because of that behavior, he started to. So when you
Yeah.
see ethno-nationalism and tribalism taking place, it's often as a form of convoluted self-defense. And you see this with the modern alt-right, is they feel attacked. They feel attacked because of how the media is talking about white people and white men and trying to,
Yeah.
this post-colonial bullshit, this
Yeah.
white guilt phenomenon. It's creating more problems than it's solving.
Yeah.
And that works for everyone. It doesn't matter what their skin color or ideology is.
Yeah.
It works for everyone.
I can't speak for other people, but I think you mentioned it earlier as well. I never really connected when I came to Canada. I never really connected with the idea of, oh, other Canadian people are white like I am. It was never. I just looked at them as just, yeah, different country, different people. I never connected and said to myself that I in some sense had an advantage or a privilege because I happened to be white. It just didn't, because I know it's not obvious to some people, but yeah, French and German people are like very different,
Oh
like
yeah, just take
in like,
Denmark and Sweden are enemies. I mean, they're
yeah,
neighbors. They're so similar, more similar than any other countries in
yeah,
the world, and yet they hate each other, and they're kind of different culturally. I've noticed as well. So
it's
it's the annoying thing is with this white guilt collectivism narrative, you're ignoring the natural diversity in white nations that already exist.
exactly, which is kind of racist in itself,
Yeah.
because you're basically saying that all white people are the same. Yeah,
And
yeah,
vice versa on the other end there in Sweden, I often see leftists essentially saying that all immigrants are the same. They don't differentiate Bosnians from Africans and Arabs
wow.
and Turks. And it's like, okay, well, that's cute because the Chetniks didn't differentiate Bosnians from Turks either. They like to call us Arabs.
Yeah, that's totally true. Yeah,
Because it's crazy when you don't have a difference between the progressive mindset of color blindness and the ethno-nationalist mindset. They're really the same on different ends.
yeah,
None of them are really embracing diversity. They're just kind of pretending it doesn't exist, or they don't want it to exist.
Yeah, seems that way. So, what do you think about the near future of Sweden, of the West? How do you see things playing out? Do you see Sweden maybe going back, getting some sense, or do you just see things gradually getting worse and worse?
Well, sadly, I think because of the NIMBY complex that's so widespread, things are going to have to get worse before they get better.
Hmm.
But I don't think people should give up and give in. I feel like the biggest problem in our Western countries that we rarely formulate is people need to practice more self-responsibility over their own happiness and their own inclusion. They have to work on their feelings of entitlement and peace damaged and materialism. They have
Yes.
to be willing to see the human of it all. And it's really annoying to me when you have too much tribalism to the point where you can't even fucking talk to someone without having a bunch of screeching morons do guilt by association arguments. Like, that doesn't help. I've noticed the main thing I've learned living in this country is that radicalization is desperation, and it's often tied to the social, and it's often tied to things like exclusion. So you
I,
shouldn't exclude people. You need to be friends with people, even if you don't agree with them.
I really like that line, responsibility in their own inclusion. That's, that's a really important statement because it actually considers the fact that identity of any kind is a negotiation between people.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't just say, I'm this and I'm that. Other people have to agree with you. It's a negotiation. And that's really the problem with this, the identity people is like, you can't just say I am trans, and because you put on a wig or something, we're just going to be like, well, yeah, you're a woman or whatever. It just doesn't work that way. It's a negotiation, and people are going to have to get there. And you know by blaming people and calling them whatever, transphobic and all of these things, that is not in any way going to lead us quicker to a position where people might actually change their mind and say, okay, well, you know I'm going to actually call you this, even though I know biologically you're not female.
Yeah, well, diversity does require the willingness to compromise and
Yeah,
respect people who don't agree, and that goes both ways. I
exactly.
mean, I feel like something people don't talk about enough is that we as individuals do have a responsibility not to manifest evil in this world. It's not anyone else's responsibility. Like,
Yeah,
we have a responsibility to manifest potential and build bridges. You're not going to see that with, I don't like what you're saying, so I'll cut you off.
yeah.
That doesn't work for anyone. It certainly doesn't work for, doesn't work for right, doesn't work for left.
I think we'll leave it there. That was great. Thanks very much for coming on to the podcast. I really appreciate
Thanks
it.
for having me. I hope more people check out your podcast.
Thanks.